Good evening, everybody. It's November. It's time for the membership meeting, and we should have a pretty full schedule tonight. So I'm really looking forward to the program, which I'll introduce after we hear all of you introduce. So let me wander over here to Dave, give him the microphone. We'll start passing it around.
Dave, W4SAR, Efland.
Karen, KD4YJZ, Eflin.
Tim, KC1TWR, Scarborough.
Brad, WZ4BSS, Hillsborough.
Hi, I'm Matthew Stafford, new here. I don't have a call sign yet. Just came here just out of interest and stuff like that. Yeah. Oh, and also Mebane.
Ron Craig, KO4RON, and this is my new best friend, Matthew here, who learned about us through the State Fair booth.
Awesome. I hope you scanned the thing I had there. Bob, W4FK of Hillsborough.
Dave, K4DJW, Rougemont.
Nick, K4NYW, Chapel Hill.
Boyd, KO4DJO, Hillsborough.
Dan, KR4UB, Southwest Orange County.
Randy, KF40, Hillsborough.
Pat, KO4QLU, Durham.
Dave, NA4VY, Cedar Grove.
Oh, N2XF, Butner.
Lori, N1YXU, and folks on Zoom include Jose, KD4JWF, Fred, KN4QBZ, Ken, KO4DHJ, JR, N4JQR, and Mark from DX and KR3AM.
Wilson, W4BOH, Hillsborough.
Okay, very good. And I'm Bruce, N1LN, your host for the evening. If I could ask Lori to bring up the agenda here, we can get this thing kicked off. Okay, so we've done the check-ins. We'll start off with a couple of opening comments. We'll pass it back to Lori so she can update everybody on the Christmas party. I think everybody here in the room has already had the update, probably signed up and already has maybe paid, but we'll let her talk to it anyway, so especially so we can get it in the recording for people that aren't here. I'm going to kick off something about upcoming elections, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on the election discussion right now, because one of the things that I said I would do when I took over this job as president is not block the program presenter and have a lot of business before the person that took all the time to put the presentation together sits around and waits. So then we'll turn it over to Nick, and he'll talk to us about U.S. Navy communications, 1950s internet. And he has some equipment over there that we can go touch and feel. Just don't kick it. It's old. It might break, but he can tell you that. And then when Nick is done, we'll come back to me and I'll get more involved in the election discussion. As you know, we always have elections in January. So I want to go through where we are right now with open offices and people that are going to be running for new re-election, et cetera. And then we'll do a checkout. So let me, with that, pass it back to Lori so she can, you coming up here? Yeah, okay, she'll be right up here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I am preaching to the choir because I looked at the sign-up sheet that was passed around last month, and just about everybody in this room has signed up. I'm going to pass it around anyway, because if you have not paid, if you would like to do that tonight, it would be appreciated. We're going to be doing some shopping for some door prizes and other things that we need for the party, and we're going to do that early next week. We will use, I'm not going to tell you what the door prizes are. There you go. You might see some of these as door prizes at the party. But for those of you who will be watching this on Zoom, or if you are going to watch it on YouTube when we post it, you haven't been to our Christmas party, I just invite you to come. It's a lot of fun. You can see up here and you'll see on the recording where it is. I've been told that this is in the southernmost part of Hillsborough, which it is. It definitely is. It's the church that Bruce and I belong to. It's a very nice facility, and we've had it there for the last 2 years. Rather than having the meeting next month, we're going to have the party, which is what we traditionally do. We ask that each couple or each person who comes to bring a dish to pass. You can sign up for that. You will see what other people have signed up for. So you might want to take a look at that and see, not to duplicate, but to bring something else. If you don't put down what you're going to bring, I will definitely be in touch, because we need to make sure that we have a nice rounded out menu for everybody. We also try to make this not really ham radio related, although maybe some of the door prizes, which you are seeing over here right now, are ham radio related, but we do try to make it really kind of a generic party to make sure that everybody is included. A lot of the family members who are non-ham radio folks attend, and we really, really want to make it special for them as well. So please, 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 if you haven't signed up, do. If you haven't paid, I've got a little box over here. If you haven't figured out what you're going to bring, kind of okay, but if you know, please write it down. And I'm going to circulate this. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you're not physically here and you're hearing this and you want to come, you still can. Because if you read the email on the reflector, you will see how you can pay, where you can send your check. Dan will pick it up. You can send me an email and let me know what you're going to bring. So you have an opportunity to be there. And Paul, if you don't mind starting that around, that would be great. Thank you. If you have any questions, just let me know. And I think I will turn this back to Bruce so he can introduce Nick.
Thank you, Lori. Appreciate it. Okay, this is slide 1 of Nick's presentation. I figured it'd be a great intro slide. So Nick England, KN4 at NYW, is going to be our presenter tonight. And you'll see U.S. Navy communications is the topic. And I've had the opportunity to go through his presentation a few times. I think you'll find it a lot of fun and very entertaining. It'll give you a lot of information about history, but the way he relates it to the current day terminology, I think is a lot of fun. So with no further ado, Nick, come on up, join the crowd, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks everybody for the invitation. Just a disclaimer, I'm not a veteran. I was a civilian electronics engineer who worked for the Naval Electronic Systems Command for some time, but I don't know as much about the operational part of the naval communication system as I do about the equipment. That's just a function of what I did. But you need to ask Dave and Dan and I don't know who else, Paul. They all know how it was actually used. So no. So let's give you some motivation. The big problem with naval communications is you're on a ship at sea. And if you don't have a radio, you don't know where your friends are. You don't know where your enemies are. You don't even know whether there's a war going on or not. All right? You don't know anything. Next slide. Is that how we do this? Yeah. So you're afloat, but you're ignorant, right? You just don't know. It doesn't mean you're not smart. It means you just don't know what's going on. Let me give you a quick example of that. This is before radio. It's a long time before radio. In the Napoleonic Wars, the French were squirreled away in Toulon, France. The French fleet escaped, but the British didn't notice. The British didn't know which way they were going. So the British fleet, in red, they head off to the east. Meanwhile, the French are escaping and heading off west. And the only way you know anything is if you happen to cross another ship who says, oh, that's not where they were. They went that away. All right. No radio. You can't communicate. You don't know what's going on. Next slide. So the British eventually pass somebody who says they went that away. So they start heading off for the Caribbean, which is where the French have gone. In the meantime, the French have met up with the Spanish fleet and they've headed back to Europe while the silly British are still heading towards the Caribbean. Next slide. Well, eventually the British get to the Caribbean and somebody says, oh, they left 2 weeks ago. Okay, so Admiral Nelson heads back to England, says the heck with this, sort of, because the French have escaped, French and Spanish have escaped, and they've gone back to Spain. Next slide. And then eventually, 7 months after this started, the British catch up with the French and Spanish and have the big Battle of Trafalgar, and that was the end of Napoleon's escapades at sea. But you don't know where anybody is. You don't know what's happening. What's the solution? Next slide. Worldwide wireless network. And that's why in the early 1900s, when radio became possible, it was snapped up by the navies of the world. The US Navy took over all radio communications during World War I. Hams, commercial stations, everything. All right, it was just too important. And they created a network to be able to communicate anywhere in the world to anywhere else in the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, secure, reliable communication using technologies before computers and before satellites. It was technologically really difficult, and it was operationally really difficult. It took a lot of people, and it took a lot of engineering in order for this to happen. Next slide. So the first thing we had to create were cell towers, right? You've got ships roaming out at sea. I mean, what do you do with your phone, right? You roam from cell tower to cell tower. In this case, the Navy built 600-foot towers in a time when a 3-story building was really something big. All right, these were monsters. There's a building down here that's 3 stories tall. All right, these things were monsters for the times all over the world, including one planned for Monroe, North Carolina. This was towards the end of World War I, and they ran out of steel. So what they were going to do in North Carolina? You're going to build 600-foot towers? No, bricks. The war ended before that happened, right? But it was in the plans, and they built the transmitters. They built 2 500-kilowatt transmitters that were going to be stationed near Charlotte and in the base of these brick chimneys, basically. All right. Next slide. So how do you, in 1910, how do you create high-power radio transmitters? Because you've got to get way out to sea to anybody that's out at sea. You've also got to be able to communicate from the United States to Great Britain to someplace else in the Mediterranean to the Pacific. You've got long, long distances to cover, so you need really high-powered transmitters and huge antennas. This was an alternator. It ran at 14 kilohertz. All right, it's a lot faster than 60 hertz that we have around here, but it worked. There's only one of these still in operation. You may know about the one in Sweden, in Grimeton. How long was the antenna? Well, it would typically hook up to 3 towers that had a triadic antenna, and that sort of acted as a top hat. And the 600-foot up lead really was kind of the antenna, which is really short for that frequency. We'll get back to that in a moment. Okay, next slide. This is one of those 500-kilowatt arc transmitters. This is a huge horseshoe magnet, and it contained the spark, the arc that created the RF energy that was then coupled into the antenna. It wasn't easy to do this stuff. With great difficulty. Several different ways. They would key to different frequencies, slightly change the frequency. Oh, the key itself? Oh, contacts this big around. Yeah. I mean, they had you had silver dollar contacts, and then that would cause electromagnet to pull down the really big contacts. Okay. They did it. Next slide. But it got easier to do that once you had vacuum tubes and you could do regular kind of things that we think about for vacuum tube transmitters in the 20s. That's when the big change came along. And then on through World War II and then into the 50s. Next slide. The Navy adopted single sideband. These are on the left-hand side, 10 kW single sideband transmitters. And on the right-hand side is a much younger me when I was working for the Navy in front of a 40 kilowatt transmitter. I used this picture from my QSL card and it said, the rig here is homebrew. We never did fire that up on 20 meters though, but I was really tempted. Next slide. One of the big problems on shipboard is you've got lots of electronics. You've got radar, you've got communications at LF and HF and VHF and UHF, and you've got all these antennas. And we didn't have computers to model these things back then, right? So how do you create a good, how do you know where to put your antennas? How do you know what kind of pattern you're going to get out of this thing? That you don't have nulls someplace where you really don't want to have a null. All right. So what do? Next slide. You build a model. This is a brass model, and it's got the antennas all to scale. It's 1/48th scale. All right. Next slide. You put this down here in a C, and you use a transmitter that's running at 48 times the HF frequency. So if you're going to do 10 megahertz, you'd run it at 480 megahertz. And there's a gantry there that you can move your antenna up and down on. And there's a turntable in the middle, you could rotate your model around. And so you can get a complete, accurate antenna pattern for the ship and then make changes to your brass model. And that'll tell you what you need to do when you build the ship or when you make a modification to the ship. All right. So you didn't have to have computers in order to do this stuff. You could make models and do it. I thought this was really cool. I never saw this one. I wish I had. Yeah. Oh yeah. I've got some patterns from some of the ships that people have sent me. Sometimes the models agree with the actual ships and sometimes they don't. Next slide. So we talked about the transmitters and we talked about the receivers at sea. Mainly what the Navy did was to transmit continuously lots of messages out to sea. You really don't want your ships talking back because the ship transmitting says, hi, here I am, come shoot me, right? Now you don't want that. So mostly, for most of your traffic, there was a worldwide network of these transmitter sites and they covered different regions of the oceans. And as you move from, we talked about cell towers before, as you move from the Washington broadcast area to the Balboa broadcast area, you would just switch which transmitter you were listening to, all right? But it covered the entire world and it took lots of these stations. So these high-powered transmitter sites, they not only had to transmit to ships at sea, but they also had great receivers, as you might imagine, in great receiver sites. But they had to transmit to each other. So if you wanted to get a message from Washington to Pearl Harbor, well, you could send a message via wire to San Francisco, but San Francisco to Pearl Harbor had to go via radio, right? Okay, next slide. And ships at sea would have little local area networks. There would be like a carrier in a task force, and there would be several destroyers that were in that task force as well. And the carrier would have much better radio equipment and antennas. And so they would capture the main transmissions and then transfer things on UHF. So they would run UHF stuff. I'm really talking here about what we call record communications, things that were written down as opposed to me saying, oh my God, there's rocks ahead, turn left, all right? So there's plenty of voice communication systems, tactical communication systems, mostly on UHF because you didn't really need to talk all the way, a long ways away with that. You didn't want your voice messages that were in the clear to go a long ways. But lots and lots of information had to flow, and it had to flow securely. Next slide. So you could send text messages, right? Well, texting is the same thing as sending CW. This is a radioman. He's copying Morse code. He's got the earphones on. He's typing on his typewriter. All right, pretty much in automatic kind of mode. He's got a bug over there on the right-hand side, so he can reply back if he needs to for anything. But you've got a record. He's typing. What's he typing? Next slide. Oh, there's some more guys here listening. Okay, next slide. There we go. He's typing this garbage down here. All right. These are 5-letter code groups. And these radiomen would sit there and listen to 5-letter code groups for hours. All right. And they were typing that up. Then you'd have to use manually, you'd have to go to a decryption machine. That's this over here. This is a KL7. It's in operation. It's similar to the Enigma machine. It has wheels that go around, and that determines what characters map into what other characters. But you had to do that manually. So somebody writes a message, somebody sends it via CW, somebody listens to the CW, types on their typewriter, you pass that over to the crypto room. The officer in the crypto room will type that into the KL7, all right? And then finally, you've got your message out there. So there are lots of places that errors can happen. The big change that happened late in World War II was, next slide, teletype. We hams call this RTTY, radio teletype. The military calls it RAT for radio teletype. Don't ask me why, but that's the way it is. This is a Model 28 teletype, and I'll show you some teletype gear here later on if we have time or if you're interested. Okay, next slide. The big thing about teletype was I could type on a message, it could get encrypted, it could get transmitted to you, you could receive it, you could decrypt it, and you could print the result. And it never had to go through somebody's brain saying, oh, did he send an A or an R? All right, never had a chance for mistyping it. So it was online crypto, and that was really, really important, because you really don't want to tell everybody what you're doing, or particularly you don't want to tell people what you're doing next. All right, next slide. So it started in the 1940s. The late in the war, the Navy actually put teletype shipboard. It was a problem if your ship was doing this and your teletype would fall over on its side. That wasn't so good. So the Navy actually paid for and bought the first 5,000 units of the Model 28 teletype, which was specifically made to operate at up to, the spec was 45 degrees angle, but it would go further. People would mount them on the bulkhead and put them vertically like that. All right. Next slide. And that lasted as the main means of communications on through the 80s. All right. This is a new ship. This was a shipyard photo before it was delivered to the Navy in the 1980s. But there's teletype equipment still there. I love teletype, in case you can't tell. Next slide. They're marvels. And like I say, we'll play with them later on. Next slide. But it's not just text messages that you want to get and that your internet needs to carry. It's also pictures. Next slide. And the main picture that you needed at sea was weather maps. So fax, these multi-channel transmissions that would come from a shore station, a bunch of them were weather information, whether it was weather information that was printed on teletype, all right, that were summaries, or whether it was maps being run via fax. So we had text, we had images, all going around the whole world, 24/7, 365. Next slide. People wanted to put more and more information into these transmitters. And so they came up with ways of taking, these are multiple teletype channels, 16 teletype channels. They would put them, compress them all into one 3 kilohertz voice channel. And if you wanted more, you'd run 16 teletype channels on the upper sideband, 16 channels on the lower sideband. And if you wanted more, you'd run 4 ISB, 4 independent sidebands. So you had upper sideband, lower sideband, and lower sideband. All right. Now that takes up a lot of bandwidth, obviously, but you can get a lot of information going that way. Next slide. I got particularly fascinated by stuff that came along after World War II when the Navy just completely revamped everything and said, we need to have a lot more automation. We need to have synthesized rigs. We need to have automatic tuning. All right. And this was a fun project, was restoring this thing. It's an automatic tune transmitter, 1949 design. They went out in the fleet in the early 50s. It's AM or CW or FSK for teletype. Next slide. And it includes a frequency synthesizer. It's got 70 tubes. Your average vintage VFO in a ham rig from the 1950s might have 2 tubes, maybe 3 for a really sophisticated VFO. All right, there's 70 tubes in this thing. And it didn't drift. It didn't drift. And it was remote controlled. You could dial up a channel, and there were a zillion relays inside this thing. There had been a zillion mice living inside it, so cleaning that up was a bit of a chore too. Next slide. And it included automatic antenna tuning. This set up on the deck near where the down lead from the antenna would be. All right, and that's over on the left-hand side is the case, and on the right-hand side is a coil inside, motor driven, so it could move and seek the lowest SWR. So it automatically tuned. You dial a frequency, it would tune everything. Next slide. I just found that era of complexity to be really fascinating. And then there were synthesized receivers. They weren't quite as big, but they still had lots and lots of tubes in order to make things work. Eventually, we got to using transistors and things became smaller. So this thing up here, which is 250 pounds or so and takes up a lot of rack space, turned into one of these receivers down here, R1051. All right, next slide. Well, you got to have local area networking, right? What do? Well, you need to have this teletype hooked up to that receiver, or that transmitter hooked up to that teletype, or that transmitter hooked up to that that handset so somebody can talk, or you just need to have all these combinations. And not just because you might like to do that, but because you might have damage shipboard, in which case you need to patch around everything. All right, you need to say, oh, that transmitter's down. We're going to switch over all this stuff that used to run on that transmitter. And you can do that just by plugging things in. Or next slide. One more. There we go. Or turning switches. These are all switches that select what goes to what. So each one of these might be to a transmitter and select which handset throughout the ship that you might connect to. Now go back one. While you're doing that, you got to be really important. You got to be really careful to keep your red information away from the black information. Red is stuff that is not encrypted. All right. That is, it says, we're going to invade this island in a week. All right. You really don't want to broadcast that. And you don't want to have your encrypted information and your unencrypted information ever get together, because that tells not only your enemy what your unencrypted information is, the stuff you want to keep secret, but it also tells him how your crypto system works. And that's really bad, because then he can read everything. So there are red patch panels and black patch panels. Oh, I didn't do it. Okay. Next slide. And the next one. There we go. So what got created here was an automatic World Wide Web. There were these communication channels that ran messages from any place to any place else. It had a header on it, on a message, and that would tell you where it was going. And eventually it would get to wherever you're going. So if you were like, oh, I don't know, someplace down in the South America, and you needed to, for some reason, get to a ship that was out in the Pacific, then you would route through Washington, San Francisco, Pearl Harbor, maybe Guam, and then out to the ship and back if you wanted to. So it's just like what we have for the World Wide Web, right? Next slide. So the URLs, we had routing indicators. And instead of having just disk drives like we do now and computers that had memory storage, excuse me, we had to put stuff on punch paper tape because that was our only storage medium. And I've got some to play with over there. So there would be these hubs. This was an internet hub, right? You've got messages coming in, you punch the paper tape. Next slide. You look at the header on the paper tape and you say, oh, this one's going to Guam. I'll take it over and put it on the Guam reader. And then that would get transmitted on via wire or radio. That would get transmitted on to Guam. Next slide. These guys are routers. That's exactly what it is. All right. And initially there were people doing this. There was, guys, men and women, would look at the tape, say it's going to Guam, take it over to the Guam machine. They were called tape apes. That was for paper tape relay centers. That was the nice name for them, tape apes. All right. But eventually, next slide, they disappeared because in the 50s, the Navy worked with Bell Labs to build relay-based systems that could automatically read the header and automatically route. So all the incoming messages come in on the left-hand side of this place, and all the outgoing messages go out on the right-hand side of this place. All right, they're temporarily stored on paper tape in case you've got a bunch of things queued up and you need to get the next message out. All right, but the actual message routing all happened via relays that would read everything. There were actually people usually around because things would break and you'd have to fix them, or your paper would break and you had to go and patch that up, whatever. But basically, there were automatic switching centers, automatic routers. They were big, all right, and they were expensive, but they worked. And this was the 1950s, mid 1950s. Next slide. For reliable HF communications, if you're on HF, you know that it's hit or miss, right? You might have a good way to work somebody on the West Coast on 20 meters, but you might not. So what are you going to do if you really want to have reliable communications? Well, you have multiple antennas on multiple frequencies. So you run frequency diversity and space diversity. And these are systems that have multiple receivers. And then they have comparators that say, oh, the strongest signal is coming in on this antenna right now, or this frequency right now. So we'll continue to print that message. The transmitting side would be transmitting the same thing on different frequencies, for example. All right. So it takes care of ionospheric fades. It's a great thing to play around with. The next slide is an early 1950s system. It was a triple diversity system. And this is what got me hooked on Navy radio stuff. I was at the Shelby Hamfest and I got a few pieces of this and said, holy cow, what did they use this for? And I started reading up on about it. And eventually I got enough to put together a complete 3,000-pound receiver. Yeah, well, sometimes you just go crazy, right? That's okay. Well, it's not on all the time. It's not like I don't have 24/7 communications. I fire things up on Saturday mornings and I get on a net that I play with all the time. And that's mostly it. But the meter does whir around when I'm doing that. Okay, next slide. So just another example of multiple receivers at a receiver site. And the next slide is multiple transmitters. These are all 10 kilowatt transmitters. This is probably in Morocco, in a station there that covered out into the Atlantic and in the Western Mediterranean. Each one of those is a 10 kilowatt sideband transmitter. Yeah, they'd have electric bill. The big version of that was the 200 kW version. That That was serious. Okay, next slide. And if you have all those transmitters and all those receivers, you got to have antennas too, right? So this is an aerial shot of a transmitter site. This, I don't know whether this shows up or not, but anyway, this is the building right there that's full of transmitters. And each one of these circles is where there's an antenna out there. So that's a ground plane for the antennas. Next slide. And you want to patch things together. Remember we talked about using patch cords and stuff? How do you patch a 200 kilowatt transmitter from one antenna to another, or a 40 kilowatt one? Well, you use patch cables, right? Except the patch cables you can see over on the left behind this fella are, you know, it's coax that's this big around, right? And they're next slide. And so that's how you patch things up, is you push them in there. Next slide. And you want to have Wi-Fi hotspots, right? You need, so they built mobile, next slide. They built mobile communication stations. They had generators. They had multiple transmitters, multiple receivers, multiple teletypes, and they could go anywhere and set up anytime. And they would ship these things around the world, actually. If you had something flaring up someplace, like we need more communications in Vietnam. Okay, put this thing shipboard, send it over there, or actually air transport. These were air transportable as well. Next slide. And in one case, a communication center in Ethiopia got shut down, Asmara, Ethiopia. That got shut down, so they really needed quickly a communication station to cover the Eastern Mediterranean. So in Greece, they sent out a whole bunch of trailers and put them all together. Next slide. They were all built in the U.S. They had all the equipment in them, everything but the people. They got there, they bolted them together, and they were operational within a very, very short period of time. Next slide. Just another room full of teletype gear. Another one of these trailers. Next slide. But the ultimate mobile radio station was one of these. There were two of these ships, AGMR-1, AGMR-2, Annapolis and Arlington, that set off the coast of Vietnam and acted as floating communication stations. You can see that what used to be the flight deck of an aircraft carrier is now chock full of antennas. Next slide. And the hangar deck below was chock full of transmitters and receivers and teletypes. Always lots of teletypes. But it acted just like a shore station, except that it sat out at sea. Next slide. For emergency operations, like we're going to invade this island, amphibious things, you need a command ship, and you need lots of, I don't know what happened there, but okay, we'll pretend that that's an artifact. I didn't do it. Okay. Anyway, you had ships with lots of transmitters and receivers, and lots of communication with shore, with the Marines that were going ashore. Next slide. It was a floating command post, and they would be off the shore of wherever the invading in Europe or in the Pacific during World War II. Teletype equipment, lots and lots of radio equipment. Next slide. This is I happen to have an antenna diagram for one of these ships. Each one of these little boxes down here is a receiver. Each one of these little triangles up here is an antenna. All right, so this is just the receiving side of this thing. These are all the cables that run up there and the patch panels, so that if you have a casualty, you can patch around the bad one. But they were incredibly complex systems that they built. Next slide. But the bottom line was somebody that was ashore carrying the equivalent of an HT, all right, could talk to one of these ships, who could transfer messages back to a shore station, which would transfer a message on back to Washington or wherever you needed to get the information, and it would go both ways. So it was a worldwide relay network that would work. Next slide. And this was mostly for tactical communications. One of the places where you really need to get a message to are the submarines at sea. And you may know that if you try to get radio waves to go underwater, it doesn't work. The only way it works is you got to have lots of power and really low frequencies. Well, really low frequencies, as Dave pointed out earlier, require big antennas. What do? Next slide. Well, you need a big transmitter. This is actually a medium-sized transmitter. These are doors where you can walk inside the transmitter. All right, that's a medium-sized transmitter. Next slide. This is a big transmitter. You're sitting in the middle of a 2 megawatt transmitter that circle all around you. This is a view of the antenna field for it. These towers are 1,000 feet tall, and they've got 50 odd miles of wire strung between them. That acts as the antennas. This one's in Maine, where you get a lot of ice and everything. So in the wintertime, they run the transmitters on half the antennas, and the other half is hooked up to 60 hertz power just to melt the snow and ice off of it. Right, and then they swap once they've done that. Yeah. Next slide. And you need, right? It's low frequency and high power. You need big coils, don't you? Yeah. Yeah, they're wooden coil forms there so the coils will work just fine. You don't have to worry about having steel or brass or something like that around there. But that just gives you an idea of the size. Next slide. This is one of my favorite pictures. So here's this chief is looking at, does this look like a really big piece of coax? It's not. It's the center conductor. He's standing in the coax. All right. This ran from the transmitter out to the base of the antenna system. Next slide. That was on the East Coast. On the West Coast, in Washington State, they built this transmitter. This looks like a building. It's the transmitter. Okay, I mean, it's pretty big, but you can see up here, there are 2 output links right there at the top of that. Next slide. That transmitter building's down here. The antennas hook up to here. Next slide. Where's a good place to put your antenna? In a valley between 2 mountains. Where are you going to put the antennas? Between the mountains. I mean, miles and miles and miles of antennas. Right? But it worked. All right. It worked. They could talk to submerged submarines doing that. Next slide. But they got even crazier. One of the communication ships had a remote control helicopter on it, hooked up to a VLF transmitter. The helicopter would pull a wire up 10,000 feet, and that would be your vertical. Yeah. Yeah. That didn't get used a lot, but what did get used a lot was an aircraft, TACAMO aircraft, would circle over the Atlantic and one over the Pacific with a 25, 30,000 foot long trailing wire hanging down from it. And they just fly a circle like that. And they had a 250 kilowatt transmitter there that acted as a relay to submarines that were out there. It was sort of experimental. It may still be operational. I don't know anything about current operational stuff. I know about older stuff. But they did build a 2 megawatt, extremely low frequency system, ran at 76 hertz, and it had a 56-mile long antenna strung along between parts of Wisconsin and Michigan. I think you get a character every 3 minutes or so. Not much. Yeah, that's really all you have to do is you've got mail. There's something going on. Go up where you can listen to the higher data rate, because they run 60 word a minute or 100 word a minute on the other VLF stations on the 14 kilohertz, 16 kilohertz stuff. They'd run that teletype. But it wasn't just technology, and as any of these veterans can tell you, it was people. Next slide. And most of the people I've talked to said, well, it was damn hard work, but it was a really great experience. It was not a great experience, not just a great experience from the standpoint of learning about electronics and learning about technology, but of experience with a lot of other people, men and women that manned the ships and manned the communication stations and so on. Next slide. So the question is, did it work? 1950 was a long time ago, folks. There were no computers, there were no satellites, nothing like that. All right, just these people and their teletypes. And here's an example. Every 4 seconds, a message flowing through NavComStay, Washington for a month, 24/7, all just continuously. Next slide. And you could get communications anywhere in the world. People would do experiments of how fast can I get a message around the world and back again. In the Morse code days, it was 15 minutes. Once you had teletype and these automated systems, it was a matter of seconds. It really did work quite well. It took a lot of money to build these systems. It took a lot of engineering effort to design these systems. It took a lot of people to operate these systems and keep them going, both to maintain them and to operate them all the time. But it really did work. Next slide. The Naval Teletype Exchange was the name for this automated system that would run, you put in the header for Guam, and it would automatically route that message over to Guam. Well, that turned into, along with the Army's system, it turned into AutoDIN, Automatic Digital Network, which used computers, big computers, but computers. And that basically turned into ARPANET, and that turned into internet. The main difference technologically, besides the speeds they run at and so on, were the early systems sent complete messages, and ARPANET and internet are packet-based systems, so they only send pieces of a message in order to get things, and then they get reassembled whenever they get to the destination. That only happened on multi-page messages for the original systems. Next page. So I hope I've told you a little bit about why this got developed and how it got developed and what it did and how well it worked. I got really interested in this. I'm a retired electronics engineer, and I've made up a website, and I've got 70 gigabytes of photos and manuals and information and videos and you name it on there so far. And occasionally I will get messages from people serving shipboard that say, have you got a manual for a TA-970? We've got one, but we don't have a manual and we need to fix it. And it's been really both interesting, rewarding, and scary to say, well, yeah, I do. Yeah, you need a part for your teletype on board your nuclear sub? Sure, yeah, I can help you out. But it's kind of scary that you've got a broken teletype on board your nuclear sub. Well, they aren't making those parts anymore. It's just crazy people like me that have got parts squirreled away. Yeah. How are we doing on time? Little bit more. Okay. I'm gonna tell you a quick sea story. Yeah. Well, we can do that. Okay, let's go ahead. Well, next slide. We'll just go through these. This is my basement. This is part of my basement. Okay. I've only got a couple of 1 kilowatt transmitters, and I've only got a dozen or so receivers that are operational, and 30 or so teletypes, maybe something like that. But I've enjoyed learning about the technology, getting the equipment to work again, and hooking it up sort of like it would be hooked up in a real on shipboard or at a shore station. So I've got patch panels. I can run any receiver to any speaker or any teletype or anything that I want to. Same thing with all the teletype equipment. Everything goes through just like it really would, except I don't have 30 transmitters. I've only got 2 or 3, right? Next slide. some more of the basement. Next slide. And yeah, some more stuff. Transmitters on the left and receivers on the right. Next slide. The big 3,000-pound receiver on the left, that got me going on all this. Next slide. Yeah, this was a project. It's a 1,500-pound transmitter that I got from a guy up in Maryland. The squirrels and mice have been living in it. So out in the parking lot, I stripped it all the way down to nuts and bolts and cleaned everything up and then brought it down to the basement and reassembled it. One piece at a time. The frame is actually aluminum, so I could carry the frame down, but I had stripped everything completely out. The modulation transformer was about 100 pounds, so that was the heaviest piece. All right, but yeah, and it works great. It was a good learning experience. It took me about a year, but you know, yeah, exactly, yeah. Good thought. Next slide. And the next slide. And then a buddy said, you know, you need a teletype to go with all that radio equipment. So he gave me a teletype, that teletype right there, actually. And I said, okay, a teletype. That's the only one I'll ever have and the only one I'll ever need. And now the other room in the basement is full of about 30 teletypes, tape punches and printers and readers. And if there were messages to relay, I could relay those messages. And I do sometimes, because we have a teletype net on 40 meters on Saturday mornings. And sometimes guys on the West Coast, I'll listen to them on SDR. I will punch paper tape here in Chapel Hill, all right, and rebroadcast the paper tape up and down the East Coast. I'm net control for the East Coast net, all right. So SDR to over the internet to paper tape, all right, and then rebroadcast up and down the East Coast. And I've checked into the West Coast net the same way with another crazy fellow out there. Next slide. Yeah, yep, Dave's got one of these. And Dan had 4 of them. Shipboard, you did, yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's sort of the end of it. It does. There's stuff in the garage and there's stuff in the storage bin. And if anybody wants to get into Navy radios, I'll be glad to help you out. My wife, she's also an engineer, and so she has some sympathy, I guess, but she says, you can do whatever you want downstairs, but it will never creep up the stairs. Okay. So unlike some of my friends who have teletypes in their living room, all my stuff is downstairs. She says you can do what you want down there. All right. But don't let it get upstairs. So here's my sea story. I've got this website that's got lots and lots of information on it. And occasionally I get messages, email from people that are shipboard and say, have you got a manual for this and stuff? Well, one time right around Christmas, I got a message from a guy that says, hey, have you got the pinouts for a TA970 red phone? That's it's a handset, red box on it, and it goes through the audio that goes to your receivers and transmitters and so on. All right. He said, I want to hook up my laptop to it so I can do WinLink. So when I get back on board the ship, he was on leave over the holidays. When I get back on board the boat, it's a sub. When I get back on board the boat, I can hook up my laptop and run WinLink and be able to get on the hand bands with the shipboard communications gear. And I'm going like, oh, I'm going to read about this guy in the newspaper. And I said, well, I don't have a manual for the TA970, but I do have one of the TA970, and I'll dope out the connections for you. So I, took mine apart, used the ohm meter, and came up with all the connections and emailed back to him. And he said, great, I really appreciate this. I don't remember what his name was now. Rob K5 something or other was it called? No. I figured this was a young electronics technician and he was going to get in deep trouble, but I hope that his chief knew what he was doing and, and then about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks later, I got an email from him and it says, "Hey, I want to thank you for giving me the information." I hooked up my laptop to the shipboard transmitters and receivers, the RT-23s and RTM-51s. He said at the red phone connections, he said, "It really worked great and I really appreciate it." And I'm going, "Oh, this is going to be like New York Times front page. This guy is in deep trouble. He's going away forever." And he said, "I really appreciate that. Bob Smith, K5, whatever, commanding officer, USS Springfield." "Oh, okay. It's his submarine. It's his sub." I guess he just wanted to get me hanging out there and see what would happen, but it's his submarine. He could do whatever he wanted to. All right. He said the guys in the radio room were really quite amazed that I did this. Probably appalled as well, but anyway. All right. But I enjoy that. And I'm in Chapel Hill and the basement is always open. You're welcome to come visit any of this stuff. And I brought along a teletype printer and a tape punch and a tape reader, and we can play with that if you want to, but we don't have to. Okay, if you got time. Okay. 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 Okay, this is a teletype keyboard and a page printer. So it just prints on a roll of paper, right? Whatever I type, it's getting printed here. This would be a typical shipboard kind of piece of gear. So, uh-oh. I didn't do it. Maybe I did. Yeah, yeah, please stand by. Oh, well. We've lost video somehow. Teletype's still working. Yeah, yeah, Dan. Yeah. I don't have one of those. Crypto gear, that doesn't show up at Hamfest. Oh yeah, yeah, we have their photographs. Actually, between my red patch panel, which is a unencrypted stuff, and black patch panel, which is encrypted, I have a KW7 crypto unit. It's just a photo. I have a rack mounted photo. That's the best I can do. Okay, here we go. We're back live. Okay, so this is a teletype. It's a keyboard send receiver KSR unit. It's just got a page printer and a keyboard. And every time I hit the keyboard, it's sending electrical signals via a current loop. It's just 2 wires. And I'm going to run it over here. I've got a tape punch. So every time I type a character, that's right. It punches a set of holes. There are 5 bits here, so it's a 5-bit character code. And if I want to read that, I've got a reader here, and I've got a message. So I'm reading a tape that I made the other day. And this is how I would typically transmit to some remote site: Guam, Philippines, Greece, Dan's ship at sea. I'd punch a message, punch a tape using the keyboard. I'd then run the tape through the reader, and that would connect to a transmitter or to a line. And it would run wherever. And if there was a problem at the receiving end, they'd let me know. And since I had the tape, I could just resend the tape again. So that was the error correction system. Every message was sequentially numbered. And if you missed a number, then you either had to wait for it to come around again, or else you could send an error message basically that said, I have garble in message 133. I didn't get 133. Send 133 again. So that's how it would work. Yeah, so I'm punching a tape. Yeah, I've just got them all wired up together. So I'm reading this tape. I'm printing over here. And I'm also punching a tape that's just a duplicate of this one. In a real situation, I might read the tape and I might need to send it to 3 different sites. So I'd have multiple punches. I mean, these rooms, these comm centers would have hundreds of teletype units. I was never in one. It must have been deafening. This is just 3 pieces of gear running. And we got to the end of the tape, and that's it. So now this tape is exactly a duplicate of that one. And it's exactly the message that typed out here, which says, I can read this. It says, from Navcom State, Chapel Hill to OCRA. BT, beginning of text, unclassified. Number 1, this is a demonstration of the tape relay system used for communications worldwide by the U.S. Navy in the 1950s. Line 2, messages would be prepared from a keyboard to punch paper tape. Line 3, paper tape would be read and transmitted to a receiving or relay station. Number 4, the receiving station would punch a tape. Number 5, the tape would be used to transmit to another station or routed to a printer to produce a local copy. What did I write here? The link between stations could be via wire or radio teletype, known as RAT in the military and RIDI to hams. BT for ending of text, and NNNN says the end of message. That's what you did. This is just a 2-wire loop. That's right. Yeah. So later systems use something that's very much like RS-232 signaling because it was more secure. This has a 60 milliamp high voltage loop, and it causes sparks. It radiates. And people said, no, that's nothing to worry about, until some Bell Labs engineers drove their van outside of a Navy communications place and read the teletype messages from outside. And they said, oh, well, maybe we should worry about this. All right. And so there was a big program called Tempest, which put shielding around everything and changed all the signaling to just plus or minus 6-volt low current signaling. And I've got some of that equipment as well, but the 60 milliamp current loop stuff is much more common. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've got one system that for the keyboard doesn't make electrical contacts, it raises levers that let photocells get light from a light bulb. All right, and so you only get a few microamps at that, but you don't radiate anything from it. So it's optical part of it, and then the actual signaling again is plus or minus 6 volts. But yeah, that's it. You're welcome to play with the toys. You're welcome to come by and visit most anytime. I'm retired. I love showing off stuff. And if you bring your car, you might find, yeah, leave your car unlocked if you come to visit, okay? Thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk about this stuff. Now back to Bruce.
Nick, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Well done. And as I said, there were a few modern terms maybe integrated with Nick's presentation, which I think really was interesting how it took World War I through World War II to what we do every day with our routers and texting and blogging and yeah, just fantastic. Okay, if we could go back to the presentation now, I want to bring up a closing comments and talk a little bit about the elections. And I've got a couple slides made up that I want to go through. The short story is we're coming up on the end of the year. Last year, we changed the bylaws for the club that the board of directors, if they had already served for 2 years, they would only need to serve for 1 year. So they could run for 1 year reelection. So we've got most of the board that's already up for reelection, or we have some openings. We've got some folks that have decided that they do not want to rerun, or they have moved to New Mexico. That might be D. Okay. And we've got some others. So let's just run through this. Let me tell you what's going on. First of all, here's your officers. Myself as president, Boyd as vice president, Dan as treasurer, and Lori as secretary. So that's your current 2024 4 elected officers. If you see in 2025, Boyd has agreed to stay as vice president. Now, that's a 1-year term. So he will be part of the slate that we will vote on in January, because January is when we do the voting. Ron, if you think of the program that we put together last year, we put together the assistant program. So Dan was the treasurer since, I think, 1832, something like that, just before that teletype was invented. But Ron was Dan's assistant, and those guys have been working together all year. And Dan is going to be stepping down, and Ron has thrown his name in to run for the office of treasurer. And he's been, yeah, congratulations and thank you, Ron. And he's been working with Dan most of the whole year, and pretty much right now is doing almost all the work. Lori and myself, last year at this time, you'll probably remember I said I'm absolutely not going to run for 2025 president. This is the end of our 3rd year. We've got a lot of stuff going on next year. I'm going to have 1 or 2 operations. We've got 3 graduations. We're selling our place in New York. We got a lot of stuff going on here. And I really don't want to be an absentee president. So that was the main reason. And of course, Lori's right there with me. So we've got some things going on this year. Now, having said that, we don't have anybody yet that has come forward and waved their hand. Let me look around the room. Okay. Oh, wait, I saw Boyd's hand move. Boyd moved his hand. Dan's sitting on his, Ron's sitting on his. So, and Dave has been president for 35 years. So we're going to give him a couple more years off before we go knock on his door. But seriously, we really need others in your club to come forward for some of these positions. And again, Ron and Boyd are both new to these roles, and Boyd has been in the vice president role for almost the whole year. And Ron, for the treasurer for next year. What we are willing to do, okay, is we would like to have an assistant position. Okay, somebody that would, if they want to run for president, please throw your name in. We can talk about it. I've got a job description. Okay, that would be great. If you think you might be interested in being the president for 2026, maybe we can work together this year, because if I'm going to be gone part of the year, well, then it would be a great position great opportunity to work together because you would be here potentially when I'm not. Okay. And same thing with Lori as secretary, because chances are if I'm not here, she won't be here. And what we don't want to do is, we've been fortunate when we've been away most of the time is we've been able to do the meetings remotely from our place in New York. Well, we're selling that. So we're going to be up there this year to sell it, not to necessarily live there. All right. But so we would be willing to work with somebody. If somebody says, yeah, I'd really like to be president, give me a year. Let me do what Ron did. Let me work together with you this year. We'll work together on the presentations, on running the meetings. When I'm away, that person could facilitate, et cetera. And we can do the same thing with treasurer, with secretary. As with treasurer, there's a role, or there's a product that needs to be delivered, not necessarily a process. So if you can get to the same product delivery using your own process, that's perfectly fine. So I may have done something for the past 3 years different than Dave has done it for the previous X years, and potentially different than the next person would do it for whatever number of years, which is perfectly fine. Okay. So I would really like everybody here in the room, at home, and that hopefully will be viewing this YouTube video to think about, would they be interested in playing the role of OCRA president or secretary for 2025, or working together with us through 2025 and then take over the role in 2026. Let us know. Okay. All right. Next slide. So here's the board of directors. D, as you can see, is open. He moved to New Mexico. John, he's got an awful lot of stuff going on for next year. And he's been on the board now, I think, for at least all 3 years that I've been president, and before that, as well as he was doing a lot of the programs. John found Nick for us. So another excellent job. Well done for John. So there's at least 2 positions that are opened up here. Wilson, Aurora, Karen, and Chris are all in the end of their 1-year extension. Okay. And they have all said that they would stay on for re-election. We haven't talked about is it 1 year or 2 years yet, but at least they will stay on for the re-election. So they'll be part of the slate that we will talk about in January. Bob is the only person that is actually in his 2nd year of the 2 years that he was elected for. Okay, so he's the only person right now we have in the board of directors that does not have to rerun for the 2025 year. It's all yours, Bob. So you can be president, secretary, board of directors. I saw him raise his hands up. Now, I don't know whether it was his thumb up or whatever, but okay. But as you see, we've got some openings in the board. Okay. And we would really like to have somebody, if you've been a board member before, say, hey, I'd like to do it again. Add me to the slate. If you haven't been on the board, say, yeah, it'd be a great way to get involved with your club, to be part of the leadership team as we put together the programs and activities for 2025. So come forward. Next slide. And then we have our support functions. Okay. Dan has been and will continue to be the repeater lead. Okay. Dan also does the webpage. I did not put that up there, but Dan, is now able to back out of the treasurer's role, but he's still a very active part of the repeater team. And as you've seen from the previous meetings about talking about frequencies, talking about DMR, what's going on in Chatham, what's going on with Durham, there's a lot of activity in the repeater team. And Dan is one of many members of that very active team. And we thank Dan for staying on, but he is, he will be still playing that role. John, he's not going to be on the board, so he won't be doing our programs. So we need somebody that can take over the role of helping identify program. That doesn't mean you need to put together the presentations. Nick put together his whole presentation, sent it to me, and I just incorporated it with the rest of our stuff. Okay. Not hard to do. If you know PowerPoint, takes you about 10 minutes. Okay. So we do need somebody though that can help us with the programs. You won't need to do one for December. That's the Christmas party. So we can worry about January. And January, typically we do a show and tell. So that might be the program. We just have to figure out who's bringing what, how do we get that coordinated? So we might have January done. So if you're interested in being the programs coordinator, January shouldn't be too hard. We can kick it off in February with something new. Field day. Well, Dave was only president for 35 years, but he's been the field day coordinator now for 38. And he has volunteered to do that again. Okay. And he will need some help. Okay. As he always does, but he has volunteered to herd the cats and get us all together for field day. Aurora, still rerunning for board of directors, but she's also said that she will stay as the lead for the ham pie group and her new role for outreach. And we talked about that at a previous meeting about some of the activities going on there. So expect her to get more involved and more information coming from her and more requests from you to participate in some of the outreach activities that she's working on. Net manager, Randy, where's Randy? There he is. Okay. So that's a new position. And that position was suggested by Bob. DFMA has a net manager. You guys don't have a job description. I asked you if you had one, you didn't. Randy asked me if we had a job description. Of course, he asked me that when I was sitting in the Frankfurt airport on our way to the Netherlands, so I answered him on the cell phone. I said, well, no, but here's a few things, and let's talk when I get back. Well, I'm back, and he has very nicely said that he would volunteer to be the net manager. And I've kind of asked him to do a little bit more with that, with the job description, not be the training coordinator, but assist whoever maybe volunteers with training coordinator to help figure out, what net, how do we do the training? Where do we do the training? Do we need to see if we can coordinate this room? There'll be more than Randy doing that. But just, it's more than, do we have somebody for net control, which could be a project because we don't have a lot of people. Again, 100 and some people in the club, and we've got 3 or 4 people now that are always net control. DFMA liaison, well, Bob is the president of DFMA. He's also on our board of directors, so he'll be the DFMA liaison again this year. And then training, we do not have a training coordinator. There's been some requests for training. Okay, well, now that we've got the frequency standards and we're trying to get more involved in emergency communications, can we do some training on the net? Okay, instead of just having in the net every week when somebody is net control. Now there's a question, is there any training? Crickets, no training. All right, so we really want to be able to understand what type of training we should be doing depending upon what direction we're going in. So we need somebody that can work with me if I'm president, or work with us if there's 2 presidents, and also with the vice president to try to pull the training together. Is it technical? Is it emergency communication? Is it whatever it is? So we'd really like to get much more involved in training this year. Anybody have any questions, either on Zoom or in the room? Anybody want to volunteer for any of these positions? They are paid positions. You will get exactly the same thing that I've received, maybe twice as much. Still no, Karen's got both hands up now. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. It's November. The voting is January. If you have any questions, my email address is, n1ln@arrl.net, which gets to me, or it's also on qrz.com. Okay, or give me a phone call. I'm not going to put my phone number here because this is going out to YouTube. But, give me a call, send me an email. Let's talk about what you might be interested in. But I'll explain it. Talk to somebody that's held that position before if you have had questions or whatever. So let's get more participation from our club beyond the 8 or 10 people that typically are waving their hands saying, yep, I'll do it, and I'll do it again. Okay. That's it, folks. Next slide. And I think that's it, folks. See you at the OCRA Christmas party. Sign up, figure out what you're going to bring for food, pay your 10 or 20 bucks, and we'll have another great time this year. Are you doing your marvelous beef or pork thing, whatever you're doing? Well, yeah, Wilson will. So we always plan around Wilson's giant piece of meat that he brings to the party. So it's always excellent. So thank you, sir. With that, thank you very much. Nick, again, thank you. The equipment is there. Feel free to walk over and just don't break it because it's the last piece he has. Here. Thanks, everybody.